The call came at 7:43 in the morning, which I know because I was still in bed, staring at the ceiling, calculating whether I had enough time to shower before my first client meeting. My phone lit up with my mother-in-law's name, and I almost let it go to voicemail. I wish I had. "Sweetheart," she said. And her voice had that particular softness she only used when she needed something. "I need you to come by the house this weekend. There's something your father-in-law and I want to discuss with the whole family." I told her I'd be there. I told my husband that night over dinner, and he barely looked up from his phone. "It's probably about the vacation house," he said. "They've been talking about selling it." He was wrong. It wasn't about the vacation house. It was about the $47,000 that had been quietly moved out of the joint account I shared with my husband. The account his parents had insisted we open together when we got married. The one they said was part of the family financial structure. The one I had never looked at closely enough because my husband handled all of it and I trusted him, because he was my husband, because that is what you do. I found out 3 days before that family meeting, not from my husband, not from my in-laws. From an automated fraud alert my bank sent to the email address they had on file for me. An email address my husband didn't know about because I'd created it years before we met, before I changed everything else, before I became so seamlessly folded into his family that I forgot I had ever existed as someone separate. The email said, "A transfer of $47,200,000 has been initiated from your joint checking account ending in 4471. If you did not authorize this transaction, please contact us immediately." I read it twice. Then I sat down on the bathroom floor in my work clothes at 6 in the morning and I read it a third time. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. I didn't cry because something in my chest went very still and very cold, the way a room goes quiet right before someone says something that changes everything. I had felt that stillness once before, when my doctor called with lab results she said were something to talk about in person. That same animal quiet. I pulled up the account on my phone. The transfer had gone to an account I didn't recognize, routed through a bank in a different state. The memo line said, family loan, family loan. I got up off the bathroom floor, finished getting ready, drove to work, and sat in 3 back-to-back meetings without saying a word about any of it. That evening I stopped by my bank's branch on the way home and spoke to a fraud specialist named Marcus. Not Marcus from the file, a different Marcus. A real one who slid a box of tissues across his desk without me asking and said, "Take your time." I took his time for 45 minutes. He printed out 18 months of transaction history for that account. I had never seen it in its entirety before. My husband had always said he'd handle the finances, and I had let him, because I was working 60-hour weeks building my client base and I was tired, and he seemed to have it under control, and I was an idiot. Looking at those 18 months was like watching a slow leak that had finally flooded the floor. Small amounts at first, $400 here, $800 there, always to accounts I didn't recognize. Always with vague memo lines like reimbursement or supplies or just nothing at all. Then larger. Then the $47,200, which apparently was not the first large transfer. It was just the first one that triggered the alert. I asked Marcus what my options were. He explained them carefully. I thanked him. I drove home. My husband was making pasta when I walked in. He was wearing the gray apron I'd given him for his birthday, the one with his initials on it, and the kitchen smelled like garlic and something sweet from the open bottle of wine on the counter. He looked up and smiled at me, and I smiled back, and I set my bag down and asked him how his day was, and he told me, and I listened, and we ate dinner together, and I did not say a single word about the 47,200 or the 18 months of smaller transfers, or the fraud specialist, or the printed transaction history that was sitting at the bottom of my work bag in a manila envelope, because I needed to know how much he knew that I knew. And at that point the answer was nothing. The family meeting that weekend was at my in-laws' house, the big one, in the suburbs with the wraparound porch, and the garden my mother-in-law had been cultivating for 30 years. Everyone was there. My husband's older brother, his wife, their 2 kids who ran immediately to the backyard, my husband's younger sister and her boyfriend who sat separately from everyone else like he always did, slightly outside the circle. My father-in-law sat at the head of the dining room table. My mother-in-law stood near the kitchen doorway. It had the energy of a board meeting. My father-in-law cleared his throat. "We've decided," he said, "to restructure some of the family finances, given some recent developments. He looked at my husband when he said recent developments. My husband looked at the table. That was the moment I understood. It wasn't a theft in the traditional sense, not a stranger with a skimming device or a phishing email. My husband had taken money from our joint account, money that included my direct deposits from the company I'd spent 6 years building, and he had moved it to an account his parents controlled, and apparently this had been discussed and agreed upon by his entire family without a single conversation with me. My mother-in-law spoke next. She said that she and my father-in-law had been supporting my brother-in-law's new business, and that it had been a family decision to pool resources, and that they had assumed I was on board because my husband had said I was. She said that last part gently. She said it the way people say things they know are indefensible but are hoping you'll let pass. I did not let it pass. He told you I agreed to transfer 47,000 out of my account? I said. My voice came out very even, which surprised me. My mother-in-law blinked. He said you both discussed it. I looked at my husband. He was still looking at the table. I'd like to see that in writing, I said. The room went very quiet. My brother-in-law's wife looked at her husband. My husband's sister looked at her boyfriend. My father-in-law looked at my husband. Now, let's not make this into something it doesn't need to be, my father-in-law said. I'm not making it into anything, I said. I'm asking a simple question. If my husband and I made a joint decision to transfer money, there should be some record of that conversation, a text, an email, something. I'd like to see it. There was no text, there was no email, there was nothing, because the conversation had never happened. What followed was 45 minutes I will never fully describe because some things are too exhausting to relive in detail. What I can tell you is that my mother-in-law cried. My father-in-law told me I was being adversarial. My brother-in-law, the one whose business had received the money, the golden one, the one who had been bailed out twice before by his parents, and was apparently now being bailed out with mine, told me I was being selfish. He actually used that word, selfish. My husband said almost nothing. He sat there and let his family call me selfish and adversarial and said almost nothing, and that was the moment I understood something else. This was not a mistake. This was not a miscommunication. This was something they had all decided together, something they had planned and executed and assumed I would absorb, because I had always absorbed things, because I had spent 5 years absorbing things in that family without complaint, and they had mistaken my patience for permission. I left that house without raising my voice once. I drove to my sister's apartment. She's the only person in my life who has never liked my husband, who said at my bachelorette party that she had a feeling, and I should just think about it, and I had laughed her off because I was in love and she was being dramatic. I knocked on her door at 8:30 on a Saturday night, and when she opened it and saw my face, she stepped aside and said, "Tell me everything." So I did. My sister is an accountant. Not a forensic accountant, not a financial attorney, just a regular CPA who does tax returns and quarterly filings and has a very orderly mind. But she knew enough to sit with me at her kitchen table and go through 18 months of transaction history and build a spreadsheet that made everything terrifyingly clear. The total across all transfers, all accounts, was $89,400, almost $90,000 that had been redirected from my income, my savings contributions, my direct deposits, over the course of a year and a half. You need an attorney, she said, tonight if possible. Tomorrow at the latest. I called one Sunday morning. Her name was Miss Hargrove, a name I found through a referral from a colleague who had gone through a divorce 2 years earlier, and she answered her cell on the second ring, which I respected enormously. I explained the situation in as much detail as I could. She asked 3 questions, all of them precise, and then said, "This is wire fraud. This is also potentially elder financial abuse statutes if any of the receiving parties are over 65, which is worth examining. Do you have documentation?" I had the manila envelope from the bank. I had my sister's spreadsheet. I had the 18 months of transaction history. "Good," Ms. Hargrove said. "Don't move anything. Don't confront anyone. Don't let on that you know more than you've already revealed. Can you do that?" I thought about the pasta dinner, the gray apron, the way I had smiled. "Yes," I said. "I can do that." The next 2 weeks were the strangest of my life. I went to work, I came home, I made dinner, I watched TV. I slept next to my husband in our bed, and I did not say a word about any of it, and he apparently took my silence after the family meeting as either acceptance or the early stages of backing down. because by the end of the first week he was acting completely normal. And by the end of the second week he had started making jokes again, and I laughed at them because I needed him to feel safe. Miss Hargrove was moving quickly. She had submitted a formal complaint to the bank's fraud department with the documentation I'd provided, which opened an investigation separate from any action we might take directly. She had also spoken with a colleague who handled wire fraud cases and confirmed that what had been done, using my husband's authorized but limited access to a joint account to transfer funds to a third-party account without my knowledge or consent, repeatedly over an extended period, was prosecutable. The signature card for the joint account, she told me, specifies that both account holders must authorize transfers over a certain threshold. Your bank failed to enforce that. They have exposure too. That gives us leverage. I hadn't known about the threshold requirement. My husband apparently had. He had kept the early transfers below it deliberately. The $47,200 was larger because he had gotten comfortable, gotten lazy, or both. Miss Hargrove filed a police report on my behalf on a Wednesday afternoon. I was not present. I was at a client lunch eating a chopped salad and discussing a Q3 deliverable, and when I got back to my office and checked my phone there was a text from her that said only, "Done. Stand by." The officers came to my in-laws' house that evening. I know this because my mother-in-law called me 40 minutes after it happened, and her voice was entirely different from the voice she'd used at the family meeting. The softness was gone. What was left was something I recognized from the earliest days of my marriage, the voice she used when things weren't going her way. Tight, accusatory, each word placed with the care of someone who knows they're in trouble but refuses to admit it. "How could you do this to this family?" she said. "I didn't do anything to anyone," I said. "Someone took $89,000 from my account without my knowledge. That's what's happening." "That money was for family," she said. "You're part of this family." "I wasn't consulted," I said. "I didn't consent. The bank didn't authorize it. And my attorney has filed the appropriate paperwork." "Your attorney." She said it like the words tasted bad. "Attorneys, I think that's what we are now," I said. "Yes." She hung up. My husband called 3 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I let that go too. He texted, "Can we please talk about this?" I screenshotted it and forwarded it to Ms. Hargrove. My father-in-law called the next morning. I let that go to voicemail too. My brother-in-law, the golden one, the one whose business had been funded with my money, sent a text that said, "You're destroying this family over money. You should be ashamed of yourself." I read it once. I forwarded it to Ms. Hargrove. I put my phone face down on my desk and I worked for the rest of the day. Here is what I want to say about that period, about those weeks of staying quiet and eating dinner and laughing at jokes. It was not strength. Or it was not only strength. It was something colder than strength, something I don't entirely have a name for. It was the understanding that I had been naive for 5 years, and that naivety had cost me nearly $90,000, and that the only way forward was through, and the only way through was documentation and precision and not a single emotional display that could be used against me later. My sister called it operating in the gap between what they think you'll do and what you're actually doing. I called it surviving. The investigation moved faster than Ms. Hargrove had expected, partly because of the bank's own liability, and partly because the transfers were well documented across multiple accounts. My brother-in-law's business account was subpoenaed. The money trail was not complicated. My husband had not used a complicated method. He had used the method available to him, joint account access, and assumed that our marriage was sufficient authorization. It was not. What I learned in those weeks from Hargrove and from the fraud investigator at the bank and from my own reading, a joint account does not mean either party can do anything they want with the funds. Both parties have rights. Both parties have legal standing. The fact that my name was on the account meant I had the same standing to report unauthorized transfers as I would have from a solely owned account. My husband's name being on it too didn't shield him, it exposed him. His parents retained an attorney. Their attorney called Miss Hargrove and proposed a resolution, full repayment of the transferred amount in exchange for dropping the criminal complaint. Miss Hargrove called me to discuss it. "That's your call," she said. "I can tell you what each path looks like." I asked her to tell me. The criminal path meant a longer process, potential restitution as part of sentencing, and no guarantee of outcome. The civil settlement path meant faster resolution and more control over the terms, but it would likely end with repayment and no criminal record. What would you do? I asked her. She paused, which she almost never did. I'd think about what outcome actually serves you. Not what punishes them most. What serves you. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about it in the car on the way home, and in the shower and lying awake at 3 in the morning with my phone on my chest. What served me was not a trial. What served me was my money back, my name off that joint account, and a divorce settlement that my attorney could negotiate from a position of documented fraud. What served me was never having to sit at that dining room table again. I called Ms. Hargrove back the next morning and told her to proceed with the settlement negotiation. Full repayment, all $89,400, within 60 days in writing, notarized, with a clause that specified what would happen if the payment didn't arrive on time. His family paid, not because they wanted to, not because they were sorry. Because Miss Hargrove had made it abundantly clear that the alternative involved a criminal proceeding that would leave a very public, very permanent mark on my husband's record, and his father's name, and the family business his father had spent 40 years building. They paid because it was cheaper and quieter than the other option. The check arrived on a Thursday. My sister came over that evening, and we opened a bottle of the good wine she'd been saving for something worth celebrating, and we sat on my porch and didn't say very much, because there wasn't very much to say. My husband moved out 3 weeks later. The divorce was not quick. These things never are, but it was clean in the way that things are clean when one party has done something so clearly documented that there is very little left to argue about. My mother-in-law sent me a card after the papers were signed. It was a generic sympathy card, the kind with flowers on the front, and inside she had written, "I hope someday you understand that family means forgiveness." There was no return address. I don't know if she expected me to respond. I did not respond. What I understand about forgiveness now is that it belongs to me. It is mine to give or not give on my timeline for my reasons, and it is not something anyone can demand by sending a card with flowers on it. I may forgive them eventually, in the private way that has nothing to do with them, the way you forgive weather for ruining a trip you'd planned. Not because the weather owes you an apology, but because carrying the resentment costs you more than it costs the rain. But that is not today. Today I have my money back, my name on an account that belongs only to me, and an apartment that is so quiet in the evenings that sometimes I just sit in it and listen to nothing and feel something that took me a long time to identify. It's peace, it's just peace. I had forgotten what it sounded like. The last time I heard from my brother-in-law was a message through a secondary account. He must have known I'd blocked his main one that said simply, "Was it worth it?" I left it on read for 3 days. Then I typed back 2 words, "Ask me." And then I blocked that one too.